Thank you so much for having me here. I will say I was just teaching a completely different class on a completely different topic less than half an hour ago, so I'm still kind of mentally shifting gears. So forgive me if I stumble a little bit over my words. I also have to say my students will sometimes give me a hard time because I try to be as non-disclosive about my own views in the classroom, and they'll often kind of like grab me by the lapels at the end of the semester and be like, what do you really think? What's really going on? And I actually really prefer not to say it because I think it produces better conversations when students don't really have a good sense of where I land. So it's a bit awkward for me having some of my students in this in the room today. I'm very glad to be here, but it's not something I'm entirely comfortable doing, being quite as disclosive as I'm going to be. That said, I understood the spirit of this invitation as being, let's have a conversation and let's be as candid as possible within this kind of conversational format. So I want to give you a window into my own thinking about some of these questions as much as possible. So the format of this, kind of in the back end of organizing it, the idea is that you have people from different religious traditions coming together to have a conversation. Professor Swamidass is coming from a Christian perspective. I'm coming from an atheist perspective. But I'm a religion professor. And people will sometimes say to me, okay, well, if you're an atheist, why are you studying religion? And my answer to that is that religion is always one of the most fascinating things that we can study because it's fundamentally the study of what matters to people. It's fundamentally the study of how people orient themselves to things that are really valuable and important to them. Although I also want to add an asterisk to that, which is I think that sometimes studying religion is about studying people's indifference, and that's just as interesting and just as important. One of the things that I think is interesting when you take this perspective of seeing the study of religion as the study of what matters to people is that the divide between the secular and the religious, this idea that religious people and secular people have fundamentally different worldviews, it actually kind of washes out. And you start to realize that very often you'll see non-religious people behaving in ways that you might call kind of religious. And sometimes you see religious people behaving in ways that you might think of as kind of non-religious. And one of the ways that I approach this topic is to say it's about this kind of underlying landscape of values. It's this underlying landscape of what actually matters to people. And one of the implications of this is that sometimes the way that we articulate our beliefs, even though it might seem like those beliefs are really central to who we are, sometimes those beliefs are not actually as determinative of how we actually interact with other people or interact with the world around us as we might expect them to be. I like to run this thought experiment with my students sometimes where I say, suppose you know the denomination of 10 people, they're all the same denomination, what political party are they a part of? Well, you can't actually predict that. The different denominations contain multiple people with multiple ideological stripes. Sort of glib, sort of obvious on one hand to say it, but it also highlights the way that these belief systems that we sometimes see as definitive of who we are actually not necessarily the operating system that we think we are. On a kind of personal note, if you'll indulge me, I come from an atheist perspective. My wife is a Catholic systematic theologian. She's somebody who is deeply invested in Christian doctrine as an object of very special interest. So on a kind of superficial level, we really could not be more different in our worldviews. If you see worldviews as defined by these kind of core architectonic beliefs about how you understand the nature of reality, we really could not be more different. And yet, we mesh very well. And I think the reason that we mesh very well is because we have very similar values. We're both very concerned with social justice. We're both very concerned with ecological justice. Even though we have very different background belief coordinates, what really matters to us is the place where we converge. So one of the things that I want to articulate is that sometimes I think we overstate the importance of belief itself. And what actually matters is something that is upstream of belief, which is what seems to matter to us in the world. And often I would argue our beliefs are kind of downstream of this much more fundamental set of questions about what matters to us in the world. Putting on my religious studies hat, there's something very Protestant about the way that we so often center beliefs in conversations like this. I just don't think that beliefs have as much significance as we often attribute them to them. We can see this when we talk about, when we look at the landscape of religious people generally. Some religious people are hypocrites, obviously. Kind of a glib thing to say. That's a theme of so many religious traditions, of religious transformations. You can see that in the emergence of Buddhism. You can see that in the emergence of the Jesus movement of Christianity, that there's a calling out of hypocrisy. And yet, that also tells this story about how religion is not dictating who and what people are. There's a more complicated set of factors that are defining how people interact with the world around them. I think you could say the same thing about atheists. A lot of atheists like to present themselves as people who have figured out the core of what it means to be a reasonable person, and they see themselves as having just a fundamentally rational outlook on the world, whereas religious people have a fundamentally irrational outlook on the world. And that's totally absurd. From an atheist perspective, that's just nonsense. Because as with my thought experiment from before, if you have 10 atheists, you can't predict their political party. You can't predict their politics. And very often, atheists interact with the world in profoundly odd ways. I have a friend, Chris Stedman, who is an atheist, does what he calls atheist interfaith activism. And wrote a book called Theist, which is sort of about this idea that we need to kind of bring people together to talk about questions of values rather than focusing on belief. And he says he gets a lot of hate mail. And I said, where does your hate mail come from? And he says, it comes from atheists. I get way more hate mail from atheists than I do from Christians because they see me as betraying the cause. Similarly, there's a real problem in certain sectors of the atheist movement of sympathy with white supremacism. Richard Spencer, who was one of the leaders of the kind of alt-right movement in the late 2010s, was an atheist and saw this as part of his project. So I'm always skeptical of this idea that atheists have a monopoly on rationality and that our atheist beliefs give us this sort of elevation over other ways of looking at the world. And I'll just close on this. I think that it's interesting and important to have conversations like this, where we really put our beliefs together, and I'm interested to see where our discussion goes. I remain a committed atheist in spite of everything that I've just said, but I also think that we need to recognize that conversations like this are, I don't want to say a distraction, but I think that they are in some ways low stakes. One of the things that I'm most interested in is having conversations with people about how we can rally around truly urgent problems that are confronting us, like the climate crisis. How do we build conversations, how do we build solidarity that will enable people from a variety of different belief perspectives to respond to urgent issues like racial injustice or the climate crisis in ways that are mutually productive? And to me, that can involve questions about belief, but I think there are other more fundamental elements that need to be brought to the surface as well. Okay, I've already gone over time. Thank you.
My name's Josh. Nice to meet you all. I have to say, Donovan, I agree with just about everything you said. It's a really good thing this isn't a debate because I'd be really struggling right now. That was all very reasonable. The topic and the prompt today is really God or nature, but I guess my point, and I'm going to tell a few stories along these lines too, is to really just question why that's even the title and say maybe it really should be God and nature. And we're also talking about the evolutionary origins of humanity, so that kind of is going to color things a little bit. It's going to come up in the questions and all that. So that's the main thing, though, that I want to get out there. I don't have some sort of pseudoscience to share with you about how evolution is false. I actually have no problem with evolution. I think that we really did arise by an evolutionary process. But I think it'd be a mistake to think that means that that's the whole story. Science, even when it's entirely correct, only gives us a part of the story. There's parts of the story that are really important. And I think the story that we get out of religion can be really critical, not just functionally, but I think there are parts of it that might even be true. All right, a little bit about who I am is I'm a PhD in computer science, but I also have a medical degree. So I went to school for a very long time. That's what that means. And I've been working for over 10 years now as a scientist at Washington University in St. Louis. And these are just some images from different things that I've done. We've done work kind of across the range, but using artificial intelligence to solve a problem in chemistry primarily, and then more recently, really trying to understand pathology images to make better decisions and take care of patients better too. So this is where I work. And you can see it up there in the corner there, that little red circle there. That's the McDonald Genome Center. That's actually where where a good part of the human genome was first sequenced about a little bit over 20 years ago. And that's where my office is. How cool is that? I'm on the top floor there, and that's where a small group of us just pursue scientific questions that might actually help patients or might just be interesting together. And that's what my job is. It's a great job. Now, kind of alongside this, I kind of got sucked into thinking about human origins. Now, of course, I was a Christian and cared about science, and so I wondered about that a lot for myself. But then about 5 years ago, I kind of got sucked up into a larger conversation and ended up writing this book. It's called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. And I think running through this book is really that key point that I was making. Like, I don't actually have a problem with evolution. I think that it really does look like we share common ancestry with the great apes. And if you look back in the fossil record, you do see this story of descent with modification that gives rise to us. That's really what it looks like. And if you want to know why I say that, I'm happy to explain it. I was raised an Earth creationist, so I was certainly not wanting that to be true. But that's the reality. You get a very different story out of Scripture, and a lot of people thought those things were in conflict, but they really aren't. I think the real challenge, the problem isn't so much evolution as much as thinking that evolution is everything. There's more to understanding where we came from and who we are than evolution. And if we can open the possibility of there be multiple stories that are all true, I think we can actually get a much clearer idea of who we are. Now, one of the cool things that we do learn about humans when we look at evolution is, people tend to emphasize how we're continuous with the animal kingdom, and that's true. But you also see things that are very strange about humans. I want to give you a couple things that are strange about humans you find out with evolution. So this is a map of where different types of chimpanzees and bonobos live. This is how evolution looks like for most animals, actually. What you see is that there's, if you count them, there's 4 different types of pan-troglodytes, that's chimpanzee, and there's one pan-paniscus there, it's blue. It's kind of weird, the shapes there. It would make sense if you knew the geography in Africa better, but between red and blue, there's actually a river, a really big river. It's really hard to cross there. North of the river, there's lions, and not that much food. Chimpanzees are pretty tough creatures, and they have very hierarchical, and they're kind of intense. You don't want to have a pet chimpanzee. You really don't. Bonobos are different, though. I mean, they're kind of in this area. There's a lot more food. There isn't lions. It's a lot safer. They're a lot friendlier. And what's also really remarkable is you can see there's like 4 different colors for the chimpanzee. It turns out that, this like fairly small area. I mean, it's like, this is over across countries, but that's still pretty small across the globe, right? You can actually genetically look at those groups and find out that they're actually genetically distinct. So that means that even though we think of them as chimpanzees, there's really, different races of chimpanzee. Isn't that crazy? And they have different, if you're an expert in it, you can actually kind of see different sensitivities and behaviors that are actually connected to genetics there. But look at this. Can you tell the difference between these two? Turns out one of them, according to Google, is a bonobo, the other one is a chimpanzee, and I can't tell you which one's which. Yet they really are genetically different. That's how it is actually for most of biology, where you see things that on the surface level look really similar, but you scratch a little bit, you find out that they actually are fundamentally different. That's actually the exact opposite of the reality we see of humans. And this is really surprising. It turns out that wherever you come from in the globe, that there's only really one species of human. We're all one family, we're all much more connected. And while you would look at chimpanzees and say there's really these genetically distinct groups, you don't actually see that in genetics when you look at humans. And it's weird, because we're spread out across the entire globe, and yet that's just the weird thing, it's different. There's other stuff too. I'll just point out, I'll just jump ahead to kind of where I think one of those places where I've really thought about where science gives us an important part of the description, but it's not the whole story. So this is another view of where I work. The blue part, those blue dots are actually where all the white people live, and the green ones are where all the black people live. And that's that line there, it's called Delmar Boulevard, and you can see X, the X is there, that's where I've worked, and that's where my home has been. And it's really a segregated city in St. Louis. So in some ways it looks like it does, like that picture of the chimpanzee is kind of separated. But if you look at the genetics, this doesn't make sense in terms of genetics. We're all actually one family, even though we don't live as one. When you want to kind of get the explanations of why things are the way they are this way, you don't look at genetics or evolution. It really ends up being far more recent things in history. Last week was an important holiday. It was Martin Luther King Day, right? This was a picture that was taken just outside my door on the 50th anniversary when he was shot. In 2017, there was another black man who had been shot in St. Louis. The police officers were acquitted, and people were really upset about it. And I remember walking out in the street, just 100 yards outside my house, and just seeing this scene of nonviolent people being confronted, almost like the military of police officers, just wondering how can we make sense of this? And I remember hearing MLK's words echo in my head, just realizing that, man, science just isn't enough. What do I have to offer this sort of world as a scientist? I really don't. And it made a lot of sense to me why, when he was thinking about where he wanted to study, he ended up not being a lowly scientist. He chose to be a theologian. In his message, he often talked about science. But I think we all know, even as atheists, that there was something real behind his call to justice, his message of the kingdom of God and what he saw in the image of God. That's something that there's something important there. That's an important part of the story. Is more than just poetry. I think there's something real there that's worth really understanding. So I think my time is up. So let's go on to that questions.
Great. I'm sort of curious about this issue of human, whatever we're going to call it, uniqueness, whatever. And I was interested in the notion you had about responsibility. I was thinking about the analogy of the deer. The deer overgraze, we say, evolution in action, they didn't know better. When we talk about a certain population in the US not agreeing that climate change is a problem, we actually make a moral judgment about that. We say, A, they ought to know better because it's self-defeating, and B, they ought to care more because it hurts others. And isn't the fact that we hold humans to that sort of high responsibility, that they have that sort of moral agency and should know better and should be able to do something differently, doesn't that in itself argue for a kind of, again, whatever you want to call it, human uniqueness, human separateness, something, isn't that something that we hold ourselves to that no other species holds themselves to? Does that make a difference? I'll just pick your answer. Thanks.
I think that's interesting. And this question of what is moral argumentation? What does that tell us about human beings that we have moral arguments? Absolutely right. The chimpanzees are not having a Veritas one.
And yet, I also wonder about the extent to which having moral arguments is a function of being a certain kind of social organism. And one of the ways I would respond to that is to say that moral arguments don't actually necessarily produce moral outcomes. Try having that moral argument that you're proposing with a certain stripe of climate change denier, and you're not going to get anywhere. And in fact, I'm actually really interested in ways that sometimes we assert a moral position and invoke the opposite effect that we intended, that we tried to do something benevolent and instead we have a kind of counter reaction. And I think you can study a lot of the political landscape in the US as a kind of counter-reaction against a kind of moral assertion. So I would just say, to me, I totally agree with you. Super interesting question, lots to explore around that. But one of the ways I would think about that is to say that this morality that we have seems to be something that is shot through with all of these other aspects of our embodied social existence, that it's not quite the superordinate faculty, like the thing that sort of makes us something fundamentally different, that we sometimes, like Immanuel Kant or something, would say exactly that this moral faculty is what fundamentally separates us. And it's just not clear to me that that's the case. But I agree with you that it's a profoundly interesting line of question.
Hello. So I kind of have a similar question for each of you. But, so for Dr. Schaefer, how heavily does your belief in the randomness of evolution of species and other natural sciences, how heavily does it weigh on your disbelief of God's existence? And for Dr. Swamidass, how heavily do the natural sciences weigh on your belief in God?
So how heavily does the natural scientists?
Yeah, like as a doctor and as someone who's been in natural sciences, how heavily does that play a role in your belief of God's existence?
Well, when I was younger, meaning like when I was in, like younger than you, like in elementary school and stuff like that. I mean, I was raised as a Christian, so I felt a lot of conflict between like kind of the story I was hearing in my religious community and what I was actually, learning about, like, when I was studying science, is really drawn to it. So there was a lot of conflict. In the end, I mean, I wanted to be faithful to the Lord and who I've encountered in the scriptures and all that. That I knew was real, but I was really struggling. I was kind of holding these things, not really knowing how they fit together. Right now, I don't actually know where the conflict is. I just don't see the conflict anymore. And a lot of that's just from understanding science better, understanding what the Bible actually says instead of what people tell me the Bible actually says. And just kind of have been kind of being a little bit older maybe and kind of being post actually kind of like those big identity crises, right? So I guess it doesn't really weigh in that much because they just seem to be in conflict. I mean, maybe I might find a conflict in the future and then we could talk about it, but right now there isn't a conflict. So it just seems like there are two stories that sometimes overlap, but they're not actually in conflict with one another, and they're telling us often very different things, but they both can be true. So I think both stories are true, and they're telling me different important things about the world.
I think you put your finger on it nicely. I mean, to me, the kind of overall picture of accident in that I think you can see in so many ways animating the natural world is definitely shaping the way that I answer these kind of bigger theological, cosmological questions. I don't know that there's even too much more to elaborate on that. I would say it weighs very heavily on the way that I think about that. It's not a deductive process. It's not you have a premise, and then you have a conclusion. It's looking at a bigger picture and figuring out what story seems to best fit what you see when you look at the wider sweep of things. But I love talking to people like Professor Swamidass because we were looking at so many of the same things, and yet the big picture for us diverges in these really interesting ways.
Hi, first I want to thank you two so much for lending your unique perspectives of atheist who studies theology and as Christians studying evolution. I think it just lent a lot to this discussion beyond if you had just been stuck in what one might predict would be your own niches, for lack of a better term. So I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one, I don't know why this came to me while you two were talking, and it's to both of you. I started thinking about the species that we, I guess, emphasize to children like when we give them the little alphabet books saying, here's a giraffe, and thinking about what do you think that the species that we emphasize tells us about our understanding of the world and the role humans play in it?
That's a really good question. I think it's a very broad question because when you say us, like I think we know that different cultures will actually emphasize different animals. There's other things too that are really interesting. I mean, while humans have really grown, one thing that's actually done, one group of animals have done very well are domesticated animals. And there's only a handful of domesticated animals actually. It's just only a handful of species. So that's a type of emphasis, and I mean that really ends up having. I think what you find out when you start studying biology, both in the past and paleontology, and also like even just in the present, you start finding out that my goodness, biology is so diverse. There are so many different types of animals out there, or that now or have been in the past. It kind of defies your imagination. It's amazing. Like I said, I have small kids right now, and they're watching nature shows all the time, and you just kind of get confronted with that. But then I'm a scientist, so I'll go read about stuff and I'll find out, oh my gosh, that existed too. It's just so much. And then I think what we kind of are presenting is a very curated, narrow list, of animals that I think it really, it is a very much a cartoon view of the world. And there's something very beautiful in that diversity whatever age you are, I think there's some real value in learning about that and being exposed to it.
I love that question, and I have a lot to say about this actually. So forgive me if this is if I go on a bit long here. There's a technical term for what you're describing. It's a charismatic megaphonic. So this means large animals, usually vertebrates, macroorganisms that are roughly on the same size scale as us, like they're not microscopic.
Or elephants, bigger.
But in the same 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, like away from us, rather than like 10 orders of magnitude away from us. So this category of animal tends to be very exciting, and they tend to be privileged, and they tend to be celebrated. And I think it actually says a lot of really interesting things, that so much of our interest is in this kind of animal. One story that I think it tells is a story about continuity. There's been a lot of speculation among evolutionary biologists, feminist evolutionary biologists, and very influenced by Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, has a book chapter called Why Be Adorable? And she makes the argument that adorableness is a property of a lot of different mammals in particular, and birds to an extent as well. And there's a kind of shared spirit of adorableness across different species within the mammalian genre, which is why we love kittens and why we love puppies in exactly the same way as grown dogs love puppies and grown cats love kittens. So I think it's actually very interesting in part how it tells this story of a kind of shared set of things that we find beautiful or things that we find enchanting in the world around us. But there's also a dark side to it. So you were talking about the proliferation of domestic animals. Some of you might have seen this statistic that if you add up the biomass of land animals, all of the kind of land animals, I guess you would say land vertebrates, you can set it up as a kind of pie chart. So actually human beings take up a huge amount of this pie chart. I want to say the last time I looked, I saw this represented, I want to say it was human beings take up about 26%. We are 26% of the weight of land animals on the earth. And 4% of the animals on the earth are wild animals, non-domestic animals. And the other 70% are our domestic animals. That's how much of an impact we have had on the environment around us, that our domestic animals now are 70% of the landmass compared to 4% for the wild animals. So this fascination with these particular kinds of animals also has a kind of dark side, because this is a big part of how we've mutilated the ecological, just the whole ecological spectrum across the planet. And it means that we ignore sometimes other really important animals like insects. Insects are extraordinarily important for the just general health and functioning of ecosystems. And it's very easy for us to ignore how incredibly important insects are, and to saturate lawns and crops with pesticides, and just gradually postage stamp by postage stamp take away places where insects can be, to the extent that they drop precipitously in their numbers. And that is also going to cause huge problems with our kind of long-term ecological outlook. So I love that question. I think it's actually really profound to think about this question of how we relate to other animals in ways that are sometimes very sometimes just kind of wondrous, but also have this dark side to them.
Thank you both so much for answering that. My second question is, one of you mentioned the term theist, and I think that means that you believe in a divine being, and please correct me if I'm wrong with that, as compared to being Christian. Could you both talk a bit on what that distinction means to you?
Well, so theist is a term that is kind of applied to people who believe that there is a God. There's monotheism versus a polytheism, right? So there's lots of gods, you might say a person's polytheist. Christians that have, recognizable Christian theology are all going to be monotheists of sort. And I'm a Christian, so I guess in that sense you could call me a monotheist. But I think, Muslims are, theists too. Jewish people are theists too. And what I was trying to say when I said is like I'm talking about something more than just mere theism, is that frankly I don't actually see kind of like this very generic lowest common denominator of theism particularly compelling, partly because of the problem of suffering. But the resources I get to kind of think about that make a lot of sense to me of it is really through Jesus and what I see that God might be doing through him. And that's not mere theism anymore. It's like a particular flavor of theism that kind of is pretty much hinged on who Jesus is and what happened in his death. So that's what I was making that distinction for. So like I say, if I found out Jesus really didn't rise from the dead, and there wasn't, and I just was disillusioned with Christianity, I probably would not become just like a generic theist. I probably would not become an agnostic. I would probably just become an atheist, or maybe an agnostic, maybe a hard agnostic. I don't know. But I wouldn't be a generic theist personally. I mean, I think there's a lot of confusing things about generic theism that all of a sudden, when I encounter Jesus, he just makes sense of a lot of it. And suffering is one of those things.
You were talking a lot about like accidents and like causation, and that kind of got me thinking about like absurdism, like other people's absurdism. So I guess I just wanted to ask, like, do you personally subscribe to like absurdism, or like what's your like moral doctrine that you kind of subscribe to?
What do you think absurdism is?
I mean, it's best like outlined in like his book The Stranger, like, and I guess it's like the more modernist approach to like, I mean, post-World War, not necessarily post-World War II, but like post like the Great Wars, that everything in life is essentially, there's like no meaning in life, and it's kind of like in tandem with nihilism, but it has like a few distinctions that, I mean, I'm not personally an absurdist, so like I can't really like make those distinctions, but I know that they would claim it to be, but like essentially like, yeah, my life itself is meaningless, there is no God, God is dead, and that there's no problem if I go kill someone right now.
I mean, you sound more like a secular humanist than a nihilist. Like you're not a nihilist, are you? Maybe. But you have a sense of value. Like you do think there's value in human life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a question of whether you think that whether in your picture of the world you need God as a guarantor of values, or whether you need God as a guarantor of meaning, and I just don't see that. To me,
that's different than the absurdism that he's talking about, right? Or,
you tell me, is it different from what you're talking about?
Well, I guess, what do you think absurdism is? I'll ask you that.
Sorry, you're kicking in my professor instincts, and I want to be like, okay, what do we mean by this? I guess what I hear when I hear you say absurdism is this idea that if there is no God, like this kind of sort of existentialist trajectory, like from the 19th century to the mid-20th century, if there is no God, then everything is permitted, there are no values, there is no meaning to life. And I'm just pointing out that that's a particular framework that assumes that you need God as a guarantor of values and meanings. So I would say, I would not use the word absurdist to describe myself. I certainly wouldn't use the word nihilist, because to me those are still kind of locked into this presupposition that we need something that is absolute in order to create meaning and value. And I think that there's a wealth of meaning and value that you can find in being a finite creature in the world and just living in the world in these rich, emotionally vivid ways that have been given to us. And I think that's sort of what you were saying before, of like, is this, that you don't necessarily need to have God in order for there to be this rich sense of value in the world. So as I understand your question, the answer would be no, that I would not think of myself as an absurdist or a nihilist.
So a utilitarian, or like, what are we looking
I think he's a secular, would you say secular humanist?
No.
Okay, would you say, I tried.
Just give me a brand and I'll leave you alone.
Doesn't really work that way, right? I mean, who has a brand? I feel like it's always about like pulling together different experiences and different ideas. I would not say I'm utilitarian.
Well, thank you.
I will say though, I mean, what you're saying does sound a lot like maybe you don't want the label, but it sounds like secular humanism. But the issue, or the question, it's not an issue, it's kind of a problem. I think it's great that you find value in human life and things like that. I don't have a problem with it if you didn't. But it's just more, it seems like there's a lot of strong ethical conclusions you come to that I don't necessarily disagree with you on those particular things. I'm wondering how you can actually come to them. Like, I mean, like, for example, one I brought up is like, is it really good for the human race to continue, or is it such a bad thing if we become extinct? Most animals do become extinct. I mean, why would we want to survive? I mean, especially because it's not even going to be any of us, right? Like, we're going to survive pretty much untouched. We're talking about generations and generations down the line, eventually at some point. And maybe it won't because of increased death, maybe it'll just because of reduced fertility, or something like that. That's not really a suffering sort of thing, right? So, like, what is it that kind of, like, how are you making those decisions? There's a lot of them in what you're saying, because you're coming to some pretty strong ethical positions over and over again that I don't necessarily disagree with them. In fact, I agree with many of them, and I would entirely endorse them. I'm glad you got there. I just don't know how you got there. It seems kind of arbitrary.
Do you need God to have values?
I didn't say, I mean, this wasn't like a trick question to say, oh, therefore you need God, and that's a gap. This is really, I mean, I just don't understand how, I mean, like, kind of like the train of reasoning that gets you there. Does that make sense? So I'm not trying to say, therefore you're deficient in God. I'm just saying that that's kind of like a missing piece in the story of how you get to that, for me.
I'm just having a hard time seeing it as a missing piece. I mean, if you're not affirming the position that you need God to have values, why would it be contentious to have values without God?
Well, no, it's more about how did you come to this. It's not about because you have values, I mean, because clearly a lot of people who don't believe in God have values. That's fine. It's more like the particular values that you're coming to, and you're presenting them in a normative way, so it's more than, I mean, it has to be meant as more than just personal preference. And I'm going to give you the example of, like, you know, what, I mean, should it be an ethical value to continue the human race or not? I mean, that seems like that's something that would be a very an important thing for you, because that's how you're applying the arguments. I'm just not sure how you, I mean, how is that a normative fact? I mean, how is that like an ethical goal? How is that ethical?
I mean, it's not an absolute normative goal from the perspective of some other, I don't know, alien being. Like, it may well be a very good thing, but I think from the perspective of us as human beings, by and large, it's just part of the framework of values that tends to course through our lives, that we see things like that as good.
Let me stop you guys right there. I think, let's move on to our next question. We only have a couple more minutes left.
Hi, so I really enjoyed hearing about your views on evolution, and you know, if humans were created, but I was kind of drawn then to wondering what your thoughts are on the creation of the universe itself, and what your thoughts are on how you think the universe came to being, and why you would put your belief in that over a God. And I guess similarly to you, how you think God might have brought the universe into being.
Well, I mean, so there's a story you got out of science, which is like the Big Bang, which kind of says there's a beginning to the universe, which was kind of surprising for a lot of scientists, actually. There's actually pretty good evidence behind the Big Bang that the universe did have some sort of beginning and a starting point. Now, it was just not 6,000 years ago. It was like over 14 billion years ago, or something like that. I'm not a astrophysicist. Maybe I got a digit wrong there with an order of magnitude. All right. All right, so you're nodding and saying I got it right. This is UPenn. That should be enough validation for me. All right. Okay. Yeah, I think God did that. I think He made everything. But the precise way how He did it is, I think, there's certainly some sort of natural laws involved in it. But I just don't think that's the whole story. Like, one thing I'll also point out too, that kind of the way how you kind of receive the scientific stories, you'll kind of say it's a string of accidents. From my point of view, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can see explained from like a law-like point of view, but then there's these things that happen that have a huge impact on the course of history that don't arise out of laws alone. Things like, the reason why we're not living amongst dinosaurs, or one of the reasons why we're all here is that an asteroid took out all the dinosaurs, right? That's not something, I mean, it's something consistent with the laws of physics, right? There's no conflict, but it's not like physics demands that would happen at that point. And it's a bit surprising. I mean, it's one of the really surprising events that gives rise to us. And there's a lot of them when you look through it. Do we want to call those a string of accidents? I mean, I guess you have to if there's no God that exists. But I think the reality of it is it's more of a question. I mean, if God exists, maybe not all of those were accidents. Maybe that was all providentially governed. Now, if God didn't exist, then maybe it is all accidental. So it's a bit like begging the question to some extent. I think I can see how the scientific account, which doesn't really give explanations for all those little details, can be entirely correct. It's just not the whole story, and that maybe God was providentially governing these things. And of course, if you're an atheist, you have to look at them all as accidents, so maybe some of that was providence.
I love that question, and honestly, there's a whole tradition in 20th century philosophy of seeing the core question of philosophy as being, in a way, asking exactly that question of why there's something rather than nothing. Goes back to Leibniz and to other pre-modern figures. But I think it's an incredibly profound question, and I think that there's a lot of intrinsic value in meditating on that question. So, what caused the Big Bang? And maybe even more interesting for me, what was happening 1 microsecond before the Big Bang? Like, what was that? And what if there was some other universe even before there was a Big Bang? Or what if there are multiple universes? To me, those are all within the realm of possibility, and it's way above my pay grade to answer that question.
I think that's all the time we have. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get another round of applause.